The Jackson Age, political changes and evolution of political parties. It's called the Jackson Age because of Andrew Jackson's political influence during this time period. The time period I'm talking about is 1815 to 1840. The objectives for this lecture are to understand the political changes that occurred during the early 19th century and development of political parties, and to be able to explain Andrew Jackson's views and his presidency. One political change that occurred during this time period was voting qualifications. Prior to the American Revolution, the qualification for voting was that you had to own property. So if you were in a lower economic class and didn't own property, then you couldn't vote and you didn't have political power. But after the American Revolution, that changes. Race replaced class in voting exclusions. So if you're a white male and you either owned property or you didn't own property, you could vote and have political power. Women and blacks were excluded from voting. White males were considered superior to non-whites and women in both character and abilities. This is an illustration of a minstrel show. And minstrel shows are reflective of the views of black people during that time period. Minstrel shows were something similar to what was called vaudeville shows. It was a comedy show. But this comedy show was ridiculing black people. You'll notice the term coons. That was a derogatory term then, and it's a derogatory term now used for black people. Minstrel shows included what's referred to as blackface. Blackface is when a white man would put on black paint and then accentuate their lips, oftentimes in white paint or something similar, and do a comedy routine. And it would make fun of black people. It would portray them as being dumb or uneducated. In your module, I've included a couple of film clips of minstrel shows from the early 1900s. This is very similar to what the minstrel shows looked like in the 1800s. So I want you to view those clips. I'm going to switch to a discussion about political ideologies. The northern states were heavily influenced by the market revolution. So most of the manufacturing in the country was done in the northern states, while the southern states remained primarily agricultural. Cotton was the South's main crop. There were two political ideologies that were going on at the time. One was nationalism and the other was sectionalism. Nationalism is the idea that a person identifies with one country or the other, such as I am an American, I am Mexican, I am Australian. And sectionalism is the idea that a person identifies with one region over another, such as I'm a northerner, I'm a southerner. Two examples of nationalism were the Monroe Doctrine, which was a foreign policy, and the America System, which was an economic system. First, the Monroe Doctrine. After the War of 1812, Americans gained a sense of nationalism. It had survived its first war as a country. It had survived a war against Great Britain. The market revolution was also happening. America had become more innovative. It had canals, railroads, was competing economically on the global scale. America will create a foreign policy called the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine was where America designated itself as having power over the Western Hemisphere. Let me give you a little background. Between 1810 and 1822, Spain's Latin American colonies rose in rebellion and established a series of independent actions. And many of these colonies were in South America. In 1822, the Monroe administration, James Monroe was the president, became the first government to extend diplomatic recognition to the new Latin American republics. And in some ways, Latin America constitutions were more democratic than the U.S. Constitution. For example, it allowed Indians and free blacks to vote. So, what was the Monroe Doctrine? America feared that Spain would try to regain those independent colonies. So Secretary of State John Quincy Adams drafted the Monroe Doctrine. And here's what it said. It said there should be no European colonization of the New World, and the U.S. would abstain from European wars, and that Europeans should not interfere with new Latin American republics. So what it's saying is America has control over the Western Hemisphere. So Europe, if you stay out of the Western Hemisphere, America will stay out of your business. So in simplistic terms, your side, my side. Another example is the America System, also a creation of James Madison. The America System was a system where the government promotes economic development. Aspects of the America System were a new national bank, federal financing for better roads and canals or internal improvements, and tariffs. And tariffs offered protection for goods manufactured in America and admitted tax-free goods that couldn't be manufactured in America. So basically, the intent of a tariff is to improve the manufacturing in America. So in other words, when you put a tariff, which is basically a tax on imported goods, it makes those imported goods more expensive to the consumers. So the consumer is going to buy goods that were made in America. An example of sectionalism is the Missouri Compromise. Missouri had petitioned for statehood in 1819, and as a result, a debate arose over slavery. Because the Constitution doesn't state what would happen to territory that was going to be admitted as a state with respect to slavery. It doesn't say whether that new state would be a free state or a slave state. So it was up to Congress to decide. The compromise was that Missouri was admitted to the Union as a slave state. And Maine, who was also petitioning for statehood, was admitted as a free state. However, slavery would be prohibited north of the 3630 latitude. So from then on out, there would be no slavery above the 3630 latitude. And this will become a major issue leading up to the Civil War. So I want you to kind of stick a pin in it for now. But what it will do is it will fuel the debate over slavery, because this idea of whether a state's going to be free or slave is going to become an issue. And it becomes an issue because if a state comes in as a slave state, then that gives the slave states more power in Congress. And if it comes in as a free state, then it gives the northern states more power in Congress. And also keep in mind that by the 1830s, most of slavery had been abolished in the northern states. So you're going to start to see this division over slavery. Other political changes that occurred during the Jackson Age were the changes in political parties. Specifically, the election of 1824. The election of 1824 led to the rise of the Democratic Party and the Whig Party. Up until that point, it was the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. But the Federalist Party dissolved and left a one-party system called the Democratic Republicans. So, these are the candidates for the presidential election of 1824. So you have Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, William Crawford, and Henry Clay. Jackson was from Tennessee. John Quincy Adams was from Massachusetts. Crawford was from Georgia. And Henry Clay was from Kentucky. And remember, they're all Democratic Republicans. So this is the result of the presidential election. So when you first look at this, you think, okay, Andrew Jackson won this election. He got 38% of the vote, and he got 43% of the popular vote. But that's not what happened, because in order to win in the Electoral College, you have to have the majority, which is 50% or more. So Andrew Jackson didn't technically win, even though he had the most votes. So when you don't get a majority in a presidential election, what happens is the House of Representatives chooses the winner. And so if you're politically connected, then you're in good shape. And so who ultimately wins this election was John Quincy Adams, because John Quincy Adams was the son of John Adams and was very politically connected. Also, Henry Clay gave his support to John Quincy Adams in exchange for a public office. So this led to the rise of the Democratic Party, because both Jackson and Crawford, particularly Jackson, felt very slighted and felt very angry that this had occurred, that this was corruption, that this was elitism. So Jackson will go and form the Democratic Party. Now, John Quincy Adams will eventually become what's called a Whig. And Whigs were generally businessmen, bankers, wealthy farmers, and their views were that they wanted a strong federal government, that they needed to promote liberty and guide economic development. Whig members supported the America system and believed that government should promote morality to take care of the welfare of the people. John Quincy Adams was a nationalist, he was an intellectual, and of course, like I mentioned, the son of a former president. And he supported all those things that the Whigs supported. Andrew Jackson was a Democrat and was elected as president in 1828. He was a war hero. He championed the common man. He believed that Indians should be pushed west of the Mississippi. He believed that slaves should remain slaves and, if freed, sent abroad. He also believed in states' rights, the idea that states should be the focus of government. I'm going to highlight 3 events or occurrences of Jackson's presidency. It gives you a sense of his policies and how he viewed America. The first is South Carolina and the nullification crisis. The second is Jackson and his Indian removal policy. And third is Jackson and the banking system. First, Jackson and the South Carolina nullification crisis. During Jackson's first term, there was a battle to uphold supremacy over state law. In other words, federal supremacy over state law, even though Jackson was a states' rights guy. In 1832, Jackson issued a tariff, and this tariff raised taxes on imported manufactured goods such as wool and iron. South Carolina didn't like the tariff, so it declared the tariff null and void. In other words, South Carolina wasn't going to pay its taxes. In response, Jackson issued what was called a force bill, which was a response to this nullification of the tariff. And part of this force bill was that he sent an army and navy to collect taxes from South Carolina. Eventually, in 1833, there was a compromise and this crisis was resolved. And it was resolved by Jackson lowering taxes. Jackson and his Indian removal policy. The expansion of cotton and slavery led to a forced relocation of Indians westward. One of Jackson's first acts was the Indian Removal Act of 1830. And this act uprooted 5 civilized tribes: the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, and the Seminole. And this law marked a repudiation or a cast-off of the Jeffersonian idea that civilized Indians should be assimilated into the American population. Thomas Jefferson believed that Indians could be assimilated into American society. He didn't believe that about blacks or slaves, but he did believe that about Indians. And in fact, one of the tribes had taken steps to assimilate. That tribe was the Cherokees. They had established schools and became farmers. But Jackson referred to Indians as savages and supported Georgia's effort to seize Cherokee land and nullify the tribe's laws. So what happened was the Cherokees were living in Georgia. Georgia basically tried to nullify the law and take away the land from the Cherokees. So the Cherokees fought back in court to protect their rights in a lawsuit called Cherokee Nation versus Georgia of 1831. It was a federal lawsuit. And in this lawsuit, Chief Justice Marshall described them as wards of the federal government. And then in another case called Worcester versus Georgia, It held that Indians were a distinct people with the right to maintain a political identity. The federal government had to deal with them, not the states, said the court. But Jackson didn't agree with this and ignores it. So, in other words, the courts were on the Indian side, but Jackson didn't agree with it. In fact, Jackson said if the justices wanted to enforce this law, they could, but he wasn't going to. So ultimately, the Indians will be displaced. And the trek from Georgia to the Oklahoma territory was referred to as the Trail of Tears. This was where 18,000 Cherokee men, women, and children were forced to move west. The Seminoles, on the other hand, fought a war against removal, but eventually were not successful. As far as Jackson and the banking system, Jackson distrusted bankers. In fact, he called them non-producers. But the U.S. Bank had a lot of power. But Jackson vetoed a bill to renew the U.S. Bank's charter. And what Jackson did was he authorized the removal of federal funds from the vaults of national banks and deposited those funds in state or what's referred to as pet banks. And he did so in part because of the U.S. Bank had lost the ability to regulate the currency and prices rose dramatically while wages started to decline. By 1836, the American government and the bank in value of currency. Cotton exports started to decline, and this ultimately created a panic of 1835, and ultimately it will create an economic depression until 1843. After Jackson is no longer president, Martin Van Buren, who's a Whig, will become president, and he dealt with this economic crisis by approving an independent treasury, which we still have today. If you have any questions, please let me know. This ends this lecture.